go. Excellent. Thank you very much, Zach, and thank you all. That was fascinating. And look, thank you everyone. My name's Sean Jacobs, and Georgina, sorry in particular for this opportunity. And my paper is on Menzies and the fall of empire, and actually presented last year on Menzies and the West New Guinea dispute. So it's genuinely great to be back. Now, I fully appreciate that I'm standing between all of you and lunch, so I promise to not trespass too much on my time. But I just wanted to cover these broad points in particular. And a lot of this is, I hope, kind of a collective counter-attack or counterpunch to the British to the bootstraps charge that Menzies often faces, and is supposedly excessive over-attachment to Britain and to empire. And obviously Menzies had a fondness for Britain, like any leader of his generation, but this was never at the expense of Australia or Australian interests. Indeed, he used this lovely term that Australians were British in sentiments and traditions only, that we weren't lock, stock British when it came to culture and society, and that's a point that he made well before, actually in the mid-1930s, I'll expand on very shortly. For Menzies, Australia came first. I think, as we've heard over, particularly this morning and just before in the last two presentations, that given our strategic reality in the 1950s and 1960s, Australia had to come first, given what was going on in our neck of the woods. Menzies, of course, was accused, or probably more of his legacy, of being stuck in the past by being attached to old alliances, and especially approached in the early 1960s and the new nationalism movement that emerged at the time. And he actually encouraged humility in Australia's foreign policy, which is something that's anathema, particularly to that new nationalism crowd that wins few prizes in foreign policy, especially when it comes to legacy, and certainly drives those charges of being stuck in the past. And obviously Menzies, I'm pretty sure everyone here will appreciate, was very disappointed by what the Commonwealth had actually become. But I don't finish on a sour note, and I talk a little bit about the new Commonwealth. So the new Commonwealth was obviously the post-empire Commonwealth that Menzies referred to, and I kind of want to finish on a bit of a high note. So the title of my presentation or paper will no doubt be familiar to everyone in this room. It's of course the term that John Howard used in his 1997 Australia Day address, for which he received quite some grief. But I found it a useful phrase, but even a framework as well, to view Menzies in the wake of the fall of empire in particular. Indeed, these terms might be more contemporary than the 61 to 66 era we're contemplating at this conference, and I see Zach ready to wrap me over the knuckles, but they evoke very similar sentiments to the criticisms of Menzies' attachment to empire. And I do find these critiques just so peculiar, because to look back at this time in particular and emerging into the 1960s, you truly see Menzies' performance at this time as one of just purely Asian achievement, whilst sustaining, of course, deep values-based attachments to Britain. Indeed, by the early 1960s, Menzies and his cabinet, guided by postures far from fearful or anxious, confidently built economic and people-to-people links with Asian governments, and simultaneously steered Australia through an intelligent resistance to communism, according to Richard Nixon. So the Colombo Plan, started by Spender in 1951, produced significant people-to-people links that blossomed to 20,000 students only a few decades later in the mid-80s. ANZUS and CETO, Menzies reflected, materially added to our safety, and I think that's absolutely true. And you could argue that ANZUS was motivated by Britain's lack of commitment to Singapore in World War II in the early 1940s. And of course, all these achievements are taking place against the backdrop of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the Suez Crisis, the West New Guinea dispute, as I mentioned before, and the Malayan emergency and the expansion of communism. So now, in terms of the first point, it's true that Menzies, like most Australian leaders of his generation, devoted a great deal to Britain. This wasn't uncommon. A lot of people here will be very familiar with Chifley's 1948 claim that, and I'll quote, "Australians know that our future is linked with Britain, not only by ties of race and kinship, but because of hard, practical reasons, end quote. Now, Menzies acknowledged the obvious fact that Australian institutions were entirely shaped by Britain. You know, there are of course exceptions. We didn't adopt a House of Lords like Daniel Dennehy notably termed in 1853 a bunyip aristocracy, but it's undeniable that the source code of how we make laws and function and interact with our political system is just distinctively British. This is just simply a reality. And I think that Menzies truly knew that empire had ended at the end of World War II. I think if you examine anything in the historical record, and I think a quote I've put up there from the Times alludes to that, and the changing temperature on empire that Menzies was entirely alive to. And the other interesting element was from a speech he gave that I touched on before, well back in 1935 to Chatham House, pointing to the fact that Australians weren't British transplants, but almost culturally British in sentiments and traditions only. And apologies, the text is a little bit smaller than I anticipated, but notable here, and I really wanted to dive into this, was just Menzies' use of the term, because to me that alludes to a British or an English universalism that's increasingly lost, I guess, on a contemporary audience, particularly the foreign policy community. I don't think one needs to possess a certain complexion or even to be born in London to appreciate distinctively British democratic institutions and values: rule of law, liberty, respect, tolerance, plurality, and the individual achievements that can emerge in such settings. And I think that these values in particular cooperate strongly with the legacy of British institutions I just mentioned before: a Westminster system, English common law, responsible government, and perhaps not always a love of cricket. And as I hope not too much of a detour, in my chapter I touched on a couple of very Menzian international examples of, I think, where this applies. So young Nelson Mandela, for example, growing up in 1920s Natal, expressed great pride attending a British school, and I'll quote, "At the time, Britain was the home of everything that was best in the world." He underscored that Britain, the home of parliamentary democracy, even offered motivation against apartheid. Other diverse figures touched by empire, from Trinidadian writer V.S. Naipaul to Nigerian academic and novelist Chinua Achebe, pay similar nods to Britain and the creative and cultural freedoms that emerged under empire and colonialism. And there's a very clear overlap with the presentation on the Commonwealth scholarships yesterday around choice, flexibility, dignity. These individuals were offered this kind of space under Britain and under empire. And I'll just include a very Menzian quote. I didn't put it on the screen, but I'll just read it out from V.S. Naipaul. When he talked about the idea of London as an open access, or Britain or the British Empire as an open access civilization. And he said, "I don't imagine my father's parents would have been able to understand the idea. So much is contained in it. The idea of the individual, responsibility, choice, the life of the intellect, the idea of vocation and perfectibility and achievement." So that was Naipaul talking in 1991 about the British Empire, and it's just a very, very, very Menzian language. And I think these points are just very worthy of contemplation, and especially against the charge that Menzies was just excessively attached to Britain, or actually unpacking what that really means. And if you say that Menzies was an excessive Anglophile, then so too are figures like this. So for Menzies, as I touched on before, Australia always came first. I think it just had to, given the strategic environment that we were in the 1950s and coming into the 1960s. The 1950s in particular were not an easy foreign policy decade, and some of the examples are on the screen there. And I've noted this because the reality of the environment that Menzies faced, of course, coming into the late 50s and the early 1960s. And I think purely just because of the strategic environment, it just offered very little space to fall back or to simply relish sentimentality at the expense of practical ties and navigating the region economically, politically and militarily. And I think Will really well touched on that before. And I think just any Prime Minister of any stripe that was excessively attached to Britain at the expense of the strategic environment would never have been able to navigate any such outcomes. So further examples show, well prior to the early 1960s, there was a very specific focus on Asia and the Pacific. So this is a quote, and again, I'm very sorry for how small it is, but from Spender launching the Colombo Plan in the early 1950s. And it's, I guess, a weary but positive example. It just very much sums up Australia's outlook, that was very much focused on our region and people-to-people ties in particular. And if we look at other products, like ANZUS over 6 decades later, today remains in place. CETO, in 3 years after ANZUS, by nations as diverse as Britain, France, New Zealand, Pakistan, Thailand, the United States and the Philippines, provided a collective shield against communism in Southeast Asia. And Abbott and Labor were hostile to both agreements, Menzies highlighted towards the end of the 1950s at the 1958 election. So on broad reflection, Menzies' foreign policy towards the end of the 50s appeared to be based on 2 fundamentals in particular. So the first was to maintain friendly relations, to be good neighbours, to have powerful friends. And the second appeared a blend of reality and humility, as I touched on before. He said that a foreign policy should be sensible, useful, not noisy, calculated to increase our security, not to lose friends. Now, it's this second fundamental where, where we can actually trace the accusations of Menzies' supposedly excessive British foreign policy. Indeed, some critics see a humble and a rational foreign policy as code for 2 things. 1, a lack of ambition to think big in terms of foreign relations, and 2, resting too much on old identities at the expense of creating new ones. Indeed, you can see this so clearly in current claims about Menzies' excessive Britishness. So on the slide, for example, is former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, writing in his 2017 memoirs. And whilst Evans noted the open-minded international outlook of Holt, Gorton and Hasluck, and the achievements of Spender, Casey and McEwen, he also writes of Menzies' excruciating Anglophilia. So I won't read out the entire quote, but I just raise this point just to highlight, despite so much regional Asian achievement that we've touched on over the last few days, and I touched on before, Menzies is still labelled like this. So just reflecting and coming to a close, in the early 1960s, there's clearly something unquenchable about the criticisms of Menzies' foreign policy achievements in particular. And I think these rest upon this fundamental and perennial question of Australia's identity at the time of cultural transition, as Zach mentioned in the conference commentary. Indeed, Menzies may achieve positive outcomes, but for his critics, these just didn't go far enough. His achievements failed to square with Australia's changing demographics, they charge, Asia's perceptions of Australia and the region's economic and political ascendance. So, furthermore, the residual effects of British influence over Australia's foreign policy, especially in the post-World War II era, supplemented by Menzies' conservative worldview, are simply all too much to be excited about or build upon as a legacy in the 21st century. So just coming to a close, the final point that I wanted to make is this one, that Menzies was clearly saddened by what the Commonwealth had become. He'd recognised its decline and dissipation, but it became clear from correspondence with Macmillan that was unsealed a few years ago in particular, that he was very concerned with the political trajectory of many post-Empire nations. And I've got a couple of quotes there in particular around India and other nations as well. So rather than finish on a low note, I just wanted to close out by building on a point that Menzies made in the 1950s, that we have the Commonwealth divided in structure, though still associated in function. It demands study and understanding. And I use the term new Commonwealth, as Menzies called the new Commonwealth, obviously the post-Empire Commonwealth. So I think the new Commonwealth in particular just offers 4 points to study and understand if it's to be relevant and maintain some function in the 21st century. So that point about the first one there, sentiments and traditions, I think that's really important, especially around the capacity of individuals to grow and to build, as Menzies strongly believed in. The second point's a very Niall Ferguson-esque point, I guess, but there's a critical difference between being settled by Spanish, French or Portuguese empires versus the British, as we we were in Australia. And I think that's just a point worthy of contemplation when we consider alternate histories, but when we also just consider political systems and institutions around the world. The third point, Achebe, Naipaul, Mandela, so these individuals thrived under the very things that Menzies believed in, a point I just raised on the first point, that space for individuals to flourish. And then just the fourth point, a lot of people forget that rather than, if you look back to the early 2000s, and I'm not saying that we need to resuscitate the Commonwealth or CHOGM in particular as an international institution, but it was a very unlikely press conference duo of Thabo and Mbeki from South Africa and John Howard exerting pressure on Robert Mugabe, going back to the early 2000s. And I think important alliances like that are really just, again, very important to consider about how we collectively respond to other democracies and other wayward democracies, especially as part of the post-empire or the new Commonwealth world. And again, it's no need to resuscitate CHOGM in the Menzian name, but rather find common themes to animate foreign policy in the theme of this year's conference for Menzies and purpose, endurance and legacy. Thank you.
I'll start off then.
Thanks, Zach.
So you sort of frame Menzies' attachment to Britain in terms of sentiment and values, and certainly the sort of institutional heritage that Australia received from Britain. Does that also then play into his sort of lament at the fall of empire, that the fall of empire is not merely the decline of British power and British control over the world, but it's a decline of this force to propagate these values that he believes in?
Yeah, I think so, Zach. I think there's probably just two things to respond to that. One is the political discipline of a lot of the leaders that he saw in particular in the post-empire world, and just the lack of discipline. And I think the other thing too is just the political convenience of a lot of what those political leaders were applying as well, in particular. So I think, if you read a lot of that, a lot of those transmissions to Macmillan, for example, in the 60s, he was really disappointed, I think, around those two things in particular. But I think it was just probably that lack of political discipline in particular, Zach, for those post-empire leaders. Yeah.
Chris?
Did Menzies ever have any conversation with views on British colonial experience? Obviously, they've taken a very different approach to their empire, retaining essentially territories that were kept out by war.
Yeah, sorry, Chris, was that French, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, microphone. Sorry, I'll just repeat that. That's much clearer, isn't it? My question was, did Menzies ever express any views on the comparative experience of the French Empire? Obviously, the French had a very different 20th century experience. They were kicked out of Algeria and Vietnam, but pretty much held on to everything else. Anything in the Menzies catalogue of thoughts and ideas on the French in contrast?
Yeah, Chris, nothing springs to mind, I guess. I'll probably have to examine that a little bit further. I think, I was sort of trying to think about, even a Suez example, and looking at 56, and how I think, I'd probably have to just dive into that a little bit more to give you a proper answer. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much, Sean. You mentioned Menzies' disappointment in the Commonwealth as it was unfolding in the 1960s. And I wondered if you thought about where the Commonwealth sits more broadly in Menzies' Australia by that period, but, in terms of popular connection, I guess. And it strikes me it's a huge gap, actually, in our understanding of post-war Australia. Even, a book I admire enormously, James Curran and Stuart Ward's
Sure.
Unknown Nation, Australia After Empire, deals briefly with Commonwealth, but not really, how shall I put it? It doesn't I think, look at popular sentiment towards the Commonwealth during that period of the new nationalism, which to my mind remained actually quite strong even into my, say, childhood in the 1970s, and perhaps even as late as the Hawke era. The Commonwealth was seen to matter in terms of how Australia saw itself in the world in a way that I think was probably gone actually by the 1990s. That's my chronology. I'm sure others have their own, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure, Frank. It's a really important point, I think. And actually, I've got a quote here. And again, I'm really sorry for the text, but actually, it's an extract from James Curran's book. And I brought my copy to get it signed by James until he pulled out. So, but look, this is Paul Hasluck in '74 responding to that new nationalism sentiment at the time. But so probably two answers, Frank. I think, the first one is you go back to that point that Menzies made in the mid-1930s to Chatham House in that speech in 1935. And it was just fascinating to actually read because he acknowledged that, we weren't lock, stock British. We didn't have this deep, attached, to Cromwell and historical dates and these sort of things that the assumption would be about Australians of British heritage in the early 20th century. He was like, we were British in sentiments and traditions only. That I think attached to that Commonwealth sort of feel and that legacy. But in terms of a second response to Frank, what Hasluck's saying here, I think, is you've got this tension between in the new nationalism movement that's emerging at the time in the 60s and the 70s, and then also just what's happening every day on the ground among everyday Australians who just maintain some of that sensibility about being British in sentiments and traditions only versus this academic, almost elite kind of performance around searching and constantly feeling for a new identity that I think everyday Australians, even today, aren't pining for, aren't searching for. And I don't think we've been, doing that, but it's been a very academic question. So I guess there's sort of two broad points to respond to you there, Frank. But yeah, cool.
And where does South Africa and Rhodesia fit into this? Is that an example of Menzies not necessarily being able to deal with the realities of the end of empire, or was standing up for their ability to act as sovereign nations and make domestic policy for themselves, ultimately more reflective of Australia's national interest in wanting to have that freedom itself? Yeah,
good question. Thanks, Zach. I think just to roll back to last year, you look, for example, at West New Guinea and West Papua and think about what was Menzies trying to do at the time. And I think if you want to add a third sort of pillar to Menzies foreign policy, he really urged that self-development among Indigenous people and among nations within the region, because I think he really knew that, West Papua, if they were going to be able to seek independence, had to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. You can apply that to South Africa, and I think Menzies would have done that as well, in Rhodesia, where you need to create very good, strong, capable individuals that create strong communities, that create decent political systems that are able to interact with institutions, respect for rule of law, decency, plurality, all those sort of things as well. But I think it's that Achebe, Mandela, Naipaul element about strong individuals, strong communities that interact and correspond well with decent institutions. So I think Menzies would have encouraged that anywhere in the post-empire world, but sadly, I guess that discipline, like I touched on before, really waned, and I guess things fall apart, and that's what happened. That's what's happened in those two nations in particular, Zach.
Anne?
Mm-hmm.
An area that this institute could touch on at some point is the fatal myth that Labor put around forever, that everything was dead during the Menzies period. We went to sleep and then we woke up with Whitlam. But if you look at what you're saying about the idea of the British Empire, it was very enculturated in our system that the sophisticated way to meet the world was to do your stint in England. And so many of our intellectuals and our artists, who were very much acclaimed here, would take that step through to the world via Britain. And I think that while the empire may have been dying, our connections with Britain went on for a much longer period, and that had an effect on our cultural differences. And in a sense, the empire ending was just forced on us, but we continued for a long time to see our connections to the world through Britain.
No, spot on, and I think, and that's why I've raised the, those very international examples of Achebe and Naipaul and Mandela even, about you've untethered politically, but culturally you still recognise the importance of going to London. It's the source code of individualism and freedom, and a lot of people have attached themselves to that. Again, even if you become untethered politically, it's culturally still so important. And even today, arguably as well, that migration that a lot of young Aussies still take to London, regardless of political stripe, of course. It's just one of those things, Yep.
Thanks, Sean.
Awesome, man. Thank you. Cheers. Thank you. Thanks so much.
We now break for